Good morning everyone, thank you very much for coming. Lovely day again today. Just confirm, my name is Kenneth Bannerman. I'm the founder and head of the Airfields of Britain Conservation Trust, or as we also call it for short, by its initials ABCT. We're the world's first national airfield charity, and we're primarily based in Glasgow. We formed in 2006. Now, before I give the usual quick podded history of the airfield and why this all matters at a bigger picture level, I'll hand you over to this gentleman that I met many, many years ago, Mr. Kerry Noble. Over to you, Kerry.
Thank you, Kenneth. Well, first of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. We've organised the weather well, so let's hope everything else goes all right. Firstly, I'd like to thank the ABCT and Kenneth for the work they do in commemorating airfields all over Britain and allowing them to be remembered, which I think is extremely important, not just because of the wartime connections, with it being VE Week, VE Day Week, etc., but also for the uses that airfields were put to following the wars after they were built. The wartime period from 41 to 45 as Brunton, although I'm obviously senile, I'm not quite old enough to remember that. So I'm sure Kenneth will give you the full potted history of the RAF involvement at Brunton. Post-war, the farmer at the time here, this is part of Tuggle Farm, Brunton Airfield is part of Tuggle Farm, and the farmer at the time was a gentleman called Andrew Robinson. And Andrew was a character. He was a Lancaster bomber pilot. He was captured, shot down and captured, so he did at least one jump. And he was imprisoned in Germany. And then, when they started moving the prisoners of war further into Germany, towards the end of the war, Andrew and one of his crew actually escaped. And they were actually on the run for 10 days before the war finished. So that was exactly 80 years ago this last week when he escaped. Okay, so he was very much an air-orientated gentleman. Everything that happened on this airfield from the post-war era onwards happened because of Andrew's generosity and kindness and interest in aviation. I first met him when I was doing a recce here in '74 to set up the Windy-Isle Parachute and Outdoor Centre, and we were looking for an establishment fairly close to Belford where the centre was to carry out parachuting, sport parachuting operations. And I discovered Brunton, came down and I met Andrew, and within 30 minutes of meeting Andrew I'd had a very large glass of sherry and I was 2,000 foot above this airfield in his own private aircraft. That was the sort of guy he was, and he carried on flying right through to his late 70s. So everything that happened was down to him. And what happened here was many things. For one very, very famous reason in this particular area, most people around and over the age of 50 learned to drive on this airfield. Right? Andrew allowed anybody to come in and operate and to learn to drive. I had notices on all the gates here, please keep to the Perry track, do not drive on the runways. And of course, civilians do not know what a peri-track is. Okay, so we had some very interesting times on takeoff on the main runway, which is up where that white shed is, past the wood, and we'd be on takeoff run with a full load, and the learner driver would lurch out from behind the trees, and no doubt got very upset when we cleared their roof by about 6 inches, giving them various waves. So interesting times. Also here, before I started operations here, we had the North of England School Karting Association, which used the end of the east-west runway here from just past that little shed up to the wood. And that was a laid-out go-kart track and was used by all the North of England schools karting clubs. We also had great usage by private pilots. The Popular Flying Association, which most private pilots in the UK belong to. And this was a very popular fly-in spot for light aircraft from all over the country, but especially from the northeast, from Sunderland, Newcastle, from up in the borders and Edinburgh. So many pilots used to come in here, have a cup of tea or drift off to the coast and fly off again. We have with us one of those pilots who also was one of my main jump pilots here for many years, Mr. Tony Flisher. And Tony still flies and has an aircraft at Esshot, and he's organised, hopefully, if it all goes to plan, we're going to have a little bit of a fly past at some stage during these proceedings. We're not sure when, so we'll just pause and wave if and when it happens. There's going to be at least 3 aircraft, and with a bit of luck there might also be a Chipmunk, an ex-RAF Chipmunk, or a Tiger Moth. So we'll see what happens. So thanks for trying to get that organised, Tony. In 1975, I founded and started the Outdoor Centre, and we started the operations here. So again, this is an auspicious week, not just VE Day week of celebration and commemoration, but also it's the 50th anniversary, almost to the day. That day was last Monday, the bank holiday Monday, the 5th, was when we carried out the first parachute jumps at this airfield. So it's 50 years. Makes me feel even older. We operated here from 75 to 81, and then we had a slight break because of changing hands with the centre up in Belford, and I went off to Spain for a couple of years to do something else. Then I came back and we reformed Border Parachute Centre and ran from 83 through to 2003. So there's almost 30 years of parachute operations at this airfield. During that time, we trained and dispatched, put out the aircraft, for those who don't understand that, something way in excess, a conservative figure of about 15,000 people actually did their first parachute descents over Brunton. Now that's an incredible number of people. It's a life-changing experience for anybody who's done it. And also, while they did that, they raised literally millions of pounds for charities. We started running for Mind, the mental health charity. We also did a year with Macmillan. We did a year with other charities. So there was millions of pounds raised. And this was the first actual parachute centre in Britain that actually was opened specifically to have charity courses. And here we have a helicopter. I don't think that's part of our fly past. Anyway, it's a welcome sight. At least we've got some avionics going on. So this was a very important site for sport parachuting in the United Kingdom, especially in the north of England. It was the only one operating between Yorkshire and Strathallan up in the mid-Scotland near Perth. Okay, so it was the only sport parachute centre in this neck of the woods. We also had here in my time the 202 Squadron, which was the Air Sea Rescue Sea Kings, which used to be based at Boomer. I'm sure many of you will remember the big yellow devils, right? And their motto was 202 Rescue You. And they asked permission to come in and use the airfield for auto-rotate landing practices and things like that, which I was quite happy to do. and they would radio me, and I would stop operations, and they would spend half an hour doing their stuff, and then they would fly off. And when they asked permission to leave the air circuit, I would say yes, today it's runway whatever, and they would take the Sea King at £18,000 an hour, and they would hover over the intersections of the runway and clear all the gravel off for me. That was their payment for the use of the facility. All that came to an end, unfortunately, in 2003, and Andrew was getting older, and he wanted to pass the tenancy of the farm to his daughter, Judy Fortescue, who I would also like to thank, and I'm sure Kenneth will as well after the ceremony, for the organisation and help she gave to ABCT to have this actually established. I met her the last time about 2 weeks ago when we had to actually establish the actual position of this monument, and it had to be moved from the original thought because there is a byway here that nobody particularly knew about, but Judy did, and I luckily knew the footpaths officer, and we got it sorted, and we had to move it slightly. And it was proved today because 2 cyclists came through this byway just about half an hour ago and got ripped to shreds because it's not maintained. So anyway, the closure happened because the Northumberland Estates, Duke's organisation, wouldn't pass the farm down to his daughter. So they had no choice but to buy it. It had been in the family for 200 years. So to do that, they had to raise money. And to do that, they had to get a developer to develop some of the farm buildings at the far side for luxury accommodation. And the developer would not go ahead with an active airfield. So everybody had to be kicked off the airfield, and that's why we have the closure notices on the gates today. I'd like to sort of finish off with a bit of a dedication. Could this be them? There's a helicopter coming back. You'll be doing guided tours around Bamburgh Castle. Okay folks, right. Aviation, obviously, of all types. I didn't mention it also, after my time here, I retired from the parachuting in '93, but after my time we also had a microlight school here, but I wasn't here at the time, I forgot to mention that. They were based in one of the buildings over the far side there. All aviation has its risks, as we well know. But luckily, in the 30 years I was involved as chief instructor of various parachute establishments, I never actually lost a customer. I did bend a few, but I didn't lose any. But unfortunately that wasn't the case all the time at Brunton. And while I was still here, we did have a serious and fatal air crash, which were 2 RAF personnel from Lossiemouth. And Phil Scott and his mate were flight sergeants, and it was his own aircraft that he'd built by hand, and it was a Skybolt aerobatic aircraft, and he'd been up here to have his annual inspection, come down from Lossiemouth, and he was due to fly back, and he couldn't do much in the way of aerobatics for us because it was a very low cloud day. So he just did a low pass in front of our establishment in the middle of the airfield, climbed up to 800 foot and did a wing over turn to head to Lossiemouth, and the nose dropped and the aircraft kept coming down. I alerted my crash crew, and we got to the woods. He went into the wood over there called Tuggle Covert, and the aircraft hit the ground and burst into flames. By the time we got there, there was nothing we could do for either of them, and we did try to put the fire out, but we couldn't, and we had to back out. So that was a sad day. Shortly after I finished operations, or just shortly before I finished operations, the BBC came and used this field to film for the BBC programme 999 to simulate a parachute accident that had happened here a year before. And unfortunately, the stuntman that they employed to do the parachuting, they wouldn't let me do it because I didn't have an equity card. So the stuntman they employed to do it, unfortunately, wasn't as good as they thought he was, and ended up going into the woods at Chat Hill without a parachute. So there was another fatality, unfortunately. Again, nothing to do with me. That was a guy called Tipping. Okay. After I finished here, my deputy chief instructor, Graham Marley, was tragically killed in 1987 when he fell out of an aircraft at 500 feet due to some, let's say, questionable flying by the pilot concerned. And he didn't have time to deploy his parachute and was lost. The only student parachutist that was ever killed here was in 2000, year 2000. And he was an early 5-jump student, and I don't know what happened, but he was a fatality here as well. So there have been 4. And considering the thousands upon thousands of jumps and the number of aircraft movements, I think that's a fairly low figure, considering the risks. However, I'm delighted that we have this memorial, and I will certainly consider the people we lost here as being dedicated within this stone. Thank you. I'm now handing you back to Kenneth.
Thanks very much, Kerry. Really great speech. Excellent. Well, as I've said, just giving you, first of all, the usual potted history. If I have to momentarily break off, it will because of this fly past that may occur, so just bear with us a little. The story of Brunton Airfield goes really back to March 1941 and is heavily connected with famous Northumberland Airfield Millfield, which is now used by a gliding club. Both these airfields, the land for them was requisitioned at that time. The airfields are quite well documented, but as we have found over now decades, there's always hidden history. And why I mention that is in the year and a quarter or so, while both airfields were being built before they opened, the planning strategies for these airfields altered significantly. They were originally designed, as eventually transpired, to be fighter operational training unit or OTU bases. But then later on in the summer of 1941, there was a significant policy change whereby it was intended that Millfield and Brunton, parent and satellite, would become the Coastal Command operated for another operational training unit. But then, come the start of 19...
Can I stop for 1 second? Just so we can get a seat for someone.
Oh, yeah, sure, I'm sorry.
And some water. I've got some water. Did you get some?
Has somebody got water? I've got water. He's okay, Kenneth.
Oh, it's okay.
He says to carry on.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, boy.
He's just fainted. Good. Here we go. One inbound.
One bus behind you.
2 inbound.
You get the video.
Give him a wave, guys. Thank you, Tony.
Brunton Airfield has very strong connections with famous Northumberland Airfield Millfield, now used by a gliding club. And the story begins in March 1941 when the land for both airfields was requisitioned. Now, the two airfields are thankfully fairly well documented, but there's always hidden history involved, as with any airfield. And what I mean by that is, in the year and a quarter between the land requisition and when both airfields finally opened, it wasn't always thought that they would be Fighter Operational Training Unit or OTU bases, because in the summer of 1941 there was an intended policy switch whereby both parent and satellite airfields would instead be used by a coastal command OTU, and this was tied in with a unit that moved to well-known northeast England Thornaby near Stockton, and the idea was eventually this coastal command OTU would come to Millfield and Brunton. But then, as often happened, plans changed yet again, so come the start of 1942 plans switched back to the original idea of a fighter OTU. Eventually, the two airfields opened in the early days of August 1942. And the first unit that was based here was number 59 OTU for advanced fighter training. It came from Crosby and Eden, better known these days as Carlisle Airport, and its satellite airfield Longtown. And as regards Brunton, the Hawker Hurricanes that were at Longtown transferred from there to here. So flying training by this initial unit carried on until January 1944, when that OTU disbanded. For pretty much the rest of 1944, there was a more specialised unit called the Fighter Leader School that made some use of Brunton. And then at the turn of 1944-45, another operational training unit, number 56 OTU, emerged and used both Millfield and Brunton. Enough to say, Brunton, and not forgetting Millfield, of course, as well, played a massive part in the winning of World War II. As regards the facilities at Brunton, it was a relatively standard satellite airfield. So there was a control tower, which sadly was later demolished in 1974, and there were, among other facilities, 4 blister hangars. Although even these hangars took time to develop, because until a while after Brunton opened, at least one of the hangars still had to be built. But aircraft that flew from here included very famous aircraft of the day, types such as the Hawker Hurricane and the 2 other Hawker types, the Typhoon and Tempest fighters. This was a very busy airfield. Come the end of World War II in Europe, somewhat topically with what's been happening elsewhere in Britain for the 80th anniversary commemorations, the rundown of Brunton Airfield was surprisingly swift. The then OTU decided on the 18th of May 1945 to start winding matters up here, and the airfield, at least in one sense, closed just 3 days later on the 21st. Now this is where it gets a bit complicated, and actually I won't go into all the technical details here, but Brunton was, at least in one sense, closed as an airfield, and what was also officially described as being inactive. But as you will see on our memorial, the actual closure date, as was recognised by RAF Fighter Command, was the following November in 1945, when the airfield passed to the War Office. Incidentally, on the same day as Boomer Airfield, where we unveiled a similar memorial 7 years ago. So by the summer of 1946, agriculture had very much come into play here. Now I won't go through the rest of the history because Kerry marvellously covered all the points there. Looking at the bigger picture, as we say in our travels, within reason, just do all you possibly can to help save, honour and protect Britain's airfields, both active and disused. They are the most tremendous forces for good, and essentially we just cannot remotely afford to lose these places in so many ways. This even, for example, comes right down to our health. That's how important these airfields are. As we otherwise just simply say at ABCT, especially back home in Glasgow, you can literally walk down the street anywhere in Britain and there are airfield links all around us. Not obvious, that goes without saying, but they're there. And if our airfields theoretically had never existed, going right back to 1909, our lives would be, without a shadow of doubt, significantly impoverished. They really would be. So again, just to say, please do all you can to help our airfields, and not forgetting all the tremendously brave and dedicated people who served at them at places like here at Brunton and Millfield and elsewhere, and in turn not forgetting their families. It's the very least that they deserve. So therefore, Kerry and I are really pleased and delighted to be unveiling this latest memorial. We've got hundreds more planned, by the way, throughout the UK. We've already got well over 200 erected already, including quite a number across Northumberland, to yet another of Britain's top physical and historical assets, the one and only Brunton Airfield. Thank you all very much. Oh, yeah, sure, sorry.
And some water. I've got some water. Could you get some?
Somebody got water?
No, I think so.
Yeah, I've got